Now you'll notice that when you pull up to it, the front door, and that's the only door that we have, is right level, almost level with the ground. When you get to the little deck that I have on the cabin, it's about 75 feet straight down to the ground. So the cabin is sitting right on a ledge, right on the edge. There's a close up of it, and you can see I've got a nice little view and lots of trees around. On the interior, it is think of it as almost like a studio, but it's shaped to create different rooms, and the fireplace helps to do that. So that's the living room, and uh, there you see the jacuzzi, and just outside of the jacuzzi on the little deck, you see the view immediately to your front. And again, if you were foolish enough to step over that barrier, you would not survive. That's just all there is to it. You go straight down. I have a little over an acre, but that acre is at about a 60-degree slant. So I don't do a whole lot of walking on my property. This is the inside. You see looking out onto the balcony, and the bedroom is off to the right. And this is on the balcony looking back into the cabin. And that basically is a little cabin that Bonnie and I purchased back in 2009. And she and I enjoyed it together till she passed away in 2016. And now I can come to the cabin, and I've got things to do, and I enjoy the experience of getting out of Abilene, going to a new place. I like to travel, and after 4 years, I don't spend most of my time crying. The first few times back, I'll be honest with you, I was just sad the whole time. But I'm happy to be here now. Well, having said that, let's turn our attention back to the American Civil War. And this is a good place to interject a lecture on Native Americans' interface with the Civil War. That's something we don't often think about. But if you understand what was going on, the Civil War had a tremendous impact, or in some ways a horrendous impact on Native Americans. It upset the balance that had developed between the various Indian tribes that existed and Indian nations that existed, and the federal government, and the Native Americans took sides. Some took sides, some took advantage, and some were taken advantage of. I'll kind of repeat that. Some took sides, some took advantage of the situation, and others were taken advantage of. And that's why I refer to it as the Native Americans interfacing with the Civil War. I wrestled with how to begin this lecture, and I decided to begin it this way. We have a gentleman who will soon be president of the United States, who a few weeks ago in a presidential debate made this observation. He said, Abraham Lincoln here is one of the most racist presidents we've had in modern history. We don't hear that very often. But that was his statement. The soon to be president of the United States, looking back on the 16th president of the United States, what image did he decide to create? He said, Abraham Lincoln is the most racist president, or one of the most racist presidents we've had in modern history. Where is that coming from? And why would he say that today? And I would suggest to you that this lecture will help you understand where he's coming from. But at the same time, I don't not even fully agree with him. I hardly agree with him at all on this issue. Was Abraham Lincoln a racist? My response there is absolutely. There's no question about it. But then Abraham Lincoln reflected the time in which he lived. Even most, with rare exception, even the most adamant white abolitionist, even the person most, or the people most in favor of the end of slavery, were at the same time racist. And that's something I had a hard time explaining to my students. How can you be a racist and at the same time, for example, supporting Black rights and supporting the end of slavery? And the answer, quite simply, is that you might believe that in a legal sense, people should be human. And at the same time, it is possible for people to believe that one group or one race or one ethnicity is intellectually superior, physically superior, whatever term you wish to use, to another. And if you believe that, if you believe that one race is superior to another, you are a racist. On the other hand, Abraham Lincoln wanted to see slavery done away with. And at the same time, that was not the only racial issue he had to deal with. The other racial issue had to do with the Native Americans, people we call Indians, and the indigenous people who came to the United States. So in October of 2020, soon to be President Biden made the observation that Lincoln is one of the most racist presidents of the United States. Well, since he was running for office, who was he appealing to? Why would he make that statement? And this might give you a clue. You're probably familiar with Portland, Oregon these days. For as far as I'm concerned, the French Revolution is happening in Portland, Oregon, even as we speak. And so a year earlier, on October the 11th, 2019, the radicals in Portland, and by the way, Portland and Oregon have changed Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. That's a tradition among the more radical folk in our culture. And so the radicals in Portland decided to have what they called the Indigenous Peoples Day of Rage. In other words, we're going to show that we're in sympathy with the indigenous people, with Native Americans, what in the past was politely called Indians. And on that day, to celebrate the rage of the indigenous people, they pulled down two statues. One was to Theodore Roosevelt, and the other, the statue of Abraham Lincoln. Now, why would they pull down the statue of Abraham Lincoln? Well, written in spray paint at the base of his statue, in this effort at iconoclasm. Iconoclasm means tearing down the images, tearing down the saints. It's the kind of thing the Taliban do. It's the kind of thing that was done during the Cultural Revolution in China. It's a long tradition in history, going all the way back to the Egyptians, that you desecrate that which you don't like. And so they sprayed on the bottom of his base, Dakoda 38, Dakoda 38. And the reference, Dakoda 38, refers back to the single largest execution, the biggest mass execution in American history, when 38 Dakota Indians, people who were part of the Sioux Indian uprising of 1862, were all hanged to death, executed on December 26, 1862. And Abraham Lincoln did sign the death warrant of those 38 individuals. And so, in this sense of rage that exists among some people in America today, among the radicals, the people that I say are bringing on a sense of the French Revolution in America, they decided that this traditional icon, this almost American saint, was in fact Satan himself. And his icon, his image needed to be not just torn down, but desecrated to show their sympathy to the Dakota 38 who were executed December 26, 1862. And then a year later, Joe Biden, running for president of the United States, in his debate with the current president, when the name Abraham Lincoln was brought up, he immediately responded, "He is one of the most racist presidents in modern history." Well, I hope that got your attention. So let's look at what was happening. Does Lincoln deserve that criticism? Does the American culture deserve that criticism. And that's for you to decide. I'm gonna make a presentation, and we'll see how you feel. I would love a discussion on how you feel at the end of this presentation. Some time ago, talking to friends of mine, rather liberal friends of mine, and I pointed out to them, I said, look, all this discussion of fascism that you're talking about, the truth is that in American history, at times, we've done almost everything that the Nazi Germans did during World War II, just not to the numbers. In other words, not as many, and maybe not to the same kind of people. And so, as a background to what happens to Native Americans during the American Civil War, I think we'll just start by using a rather loaded word, or two words actually, ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing. That's a modern word. It's come into use in the 20th century, and it's a form of genocide. Ethnic cleansing means that you don't necessarily kill everyone of a different race, but you cleanse, you get rid of them, you move them away from where your race, and in your mind, your superior race needs to be. And we've seen many incidences of that in our lifetime in different parts of the world, ethnic cleansing. And it's among the list of things that's condemned by what I would call civilized people today. And yet, if we want to talk about what happened to Native Americans in the course of American history, the word ethnic cleansing is appropriate. And so let's begin to understand that. Get just a little bit of background, and then we'll be into the American Civil War. Almost from the beginning, the English settlers who came to America practiced ethnic cleansing. Now, before we condemn them too much, obviously you condemn them for practicing that, understand that this kind of attitude is not limited to Anglo-Saxons. It's not limited to Caucasians. Just because you're born white doesn't necessarily mean that that you've inherited everything that the devil has. About 30 years ago, just a little less than 30 years ago, when I was in China, in Central Africa, there was a nasty situation which two tribes, the Burundans and the Rwandans, very similar name, came to kill each other in mass numbers. In fact, I'm acquainted with, I know fairly well, a Rwandan who, in his left hand is just made of wood, because the other ethnic group, when they captured him, slowly cut his hand off. In other words, ethnic sins, for lack of a better term, is not limited to any one group. It is a common, tragic, unfortunate element of humankind. And read the Bible. Ethnic cleansing occurs in a number of places, and ethnic prejudice occurs in a number of places in many of the biblical accounts. Read the book of Esther. You can really see it there. And so the fact that the Puritans came to America and began to ethnically cleanse this area makes sense. If you've ever suffered culture shock, have you ever gone to somebody else's culture and at first, you're kind of enthused and you're excited, but then as you stay there longer and longer, you begin to lose touch with your own culture. You don't understand why people do things, and you begin to see the people in the culture that you're in as just not being civilized. They don't do things right. And I've had this discussion with Chinese friends that I lived there for a year and have been back several times, and I asked them, what did you see when you got to America? What was your cultural experience and your culture shock? And it's always fun and rather interesting to see what shocks them. Incidentally, one of the things the Chinese cannot figure out is why we grow grass and then don't let it grow. We just keep mowing it down. That doesn't make any sense in the world to them. And being the way I am, it kind of doesn't make much sense to me, but that's a different issue. So what happened to the Puritans in particular? The Puritans were Calvinistic. They believed in Calvinistic contract theology. They believed that they were the new Hebrews, that God had specially chosen them, that they had a covenant with God, a contract with God, that they had crossed the Atlantic Ocean the same way that the Hebrews had crossed the Dead Sea. And when they came into contact with Native Americans, they came into contact with people whose values and ways of seeing things was radically different from theirs. And the Puritans began to literally see the Indians, especially the Pequot Indians, as the Canaanites, as Satan's Satan loose in the wilderness. And within a very short time, the Puritans arrived in 1636, and the following year, in 1637, you have what's called the Pequot War, where the Puritans attacked very early in the morning several Pequot villages and literally slaughtered everyone in them. And the ones that survived were sold into slavery in the West Indies. The Pequot tribe was virtually annihilated. They were ethnically cleansed from the area. Later, a descendant of those Puritans, the first true historian in American history, looked back on that, and here's his observation. His name was Cotton Mather. And in a little book called Magnalia Christi Americana, which roughly translates to the glory of Christ in America, here's what he said. In a little more than 1 hour, 500 or 600 of these barbarians were dismissed from a world that was burdened with them. All about the bodies of so many natives barbecued, where the English had been doing a good morning's work. Heaven smiled. Heaven smiled. And you see then this tension that develops as people from different cultures with different value systems, and in the case of the Anglo-Saxons, more specifically the Puritans, believing that they were doing God's will, that just as God had said, wipe out the Canaanites, they were dedicated to wiping out the sons of Satan, the Canaanites, who they identified as the Native Americans. Tragically, this idea has been repeated time and time and time and time again in American history. In an earlier lecture, setting up the foundations for what happens in the American Civil War, we referred to the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And of course, the whole purpose of the Indian Removal Act was to move these Native Americans out of the American Southeast, out of Alabama and Georgia, Mississippi and Tennessee, North Carolina and Florida, and to resettle them in a place where they would no longer stand in the way of the whites who they believed were the natural inheritors of those areas. And look what Andrew Jackson said. What good man would prefer a country covered with forest and raged by a few thousand savages to our extensive republic, studded with cities and towns and prosperous farms, embellished with all the improvements which art can devise or industry execute, occupied by more than 12 million happy people, and filled with all the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion? In other words, he's doing a cultural comparison. And he's saying that other ethnic group, well, they're barbarians. They're living in forest, and that's not right. God would want us to have people living in cities and civilization, and 12 million happy people filled with the blessings of liberty, civilization, and religion. As a result of that, you have the attempt to move the Native Americans to the West. And that's the Second Seminole War. It was a resistance to that. And the particular image that I have on the screen here is a piece of propaganda. It's from a children's book, and it's showing the savageness, the viciousness, not only of Native Americans, but also of Negroes. In other words, the Seminoles are a mixed race group. They're both black and white. They intermarried, and so in a book published in 1836 for children, you have this image, and you see this particular thing that's being taught to the children. This represents the horrid massacre of the whites in Florida in December 1835, and January and February and March and April 1836. Nearly 400, including women and children, fell victims to the barbarity of the Negroes and Indians. And it's from a children's book published in 1836. Ultimately, of course, the Indians were removed. And of course, they were marched from Georgia and Tennessee, North Carolina, eventually from Florida, and Alabama and Mississippi westward along what we call the Trail of Tears. And it's actually several trails and several different movements. But in the largest of these, which was moving 16,000 people at one time in the dead of winter, some 4,000, one out of every four, died in this Trail of Tears. And that's why these gentlemen, elderly, having a reunion, they're Cherokee Indians who were Confederate veterans in 1903, but they can observe that the 5 nations forcibly removed from the Indian Territory, Oklahoma, largely sided with the Confederacy. In other words, this whole practice of ethnic cleansing, of moving the Indians every time that whites wanted to settle an area, of abuse and a lack of respect for their rights, caused the people living in what was called the Indian Territory, and today we call it Oklahoma, to side basically with the Confederacy. So there are 2 parts then that I want to deal with. The first part of this lecture deals with what are called the 5 civilized tribes and the Confederate States of America. And you see an image of a man by the name of Brigadier General Stan Waddy. Stan Waddy. He is the only Native American on either side, Union or Confederate, to rise to the rank of general. He became a brigadier general fighting for the Confederacy, and he was a leader of the Cherokee nations. So let's look at this point and see what was happening to the 5 civilized tribes, as they were called, who made up most of the inhabitants of the Indian Territory. The Confederate States of America, when it looked at the Indian Territory, saw the Native Americans living there as potential allies, in fact, needful allies. And the reason that they needed them was because the Confederacy wanted to exist all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And it came very close to that. At its peak, early in the war, it existed all the way out to what is now California. And the basic goal was to eventually either conquer Southern California or to conquer what's called Baja California, which is in Mexico, and give the Confederacy a 2-coast environment, just as the United States of America had a 2-coast environment. But they could only do this if they had the assistance of Native Americans. And that's why these people were of value to the Confederate States of America. Native Americans, on the other hand, thoroughly distrusted the federal government, the government of the United States of America, and they had every reason to do so. They have been consistently dealt with in a horrendous way. Their treaties had been violated. Their promises had been violated. They had suffered greatly as Anglo-Americans and other white ethnic groups are moving westward. every time that meant that we're constantly coming into contact with the Native Americans, whose culture and values were perceived as being different, and tremendous prejudice on both sides. Tremendous prejudice on both sides. Indian, Native American, and Anglo or really Caucasian existed. And so as the Civil War develops, and it's obvious that the Native Americans are pretty much going to have to take sides in this, the tendency among most of those living in the Indian Territory was to think in terms of not supporting the government of Abraham Lincoln. And they had good reason to do this. After all, the Indians referred to the removal under Andrew Jackson and his followers, who was succeeding presidents, not as the Trail of Tears, which most of us knew about it, but as the trail upon which we wept, or really a stronger way of defining their words, the trails upon which we wailed. We wailed. In other words, we didn't just lose lives. We lost a culture. We lost our past. We lost our ancestry. We lost everything that gave meaning to our lives as we were being uprooted and forced to move as the federal government engaged in what I'm calling ethnic cleansing. And so this was the trail upon which we wept, or the trail upon which we wailed at the loss that we had. And they especially had a problem with the Republican Party. The Republican Party traditionally has been the nativist party. The party that, and this goes all the way back to the Whigs, and before the Whigs, the Federalists. They were the ones that were most suspicious of foreigners, and also most suspicious of people who were different, such as the Native Americans. And a leader, William Seward, who was Secretary of State, but when he was running for president, in other words, he was the leading candidate for president early in 1860. Now, he was beaten by Abraham Lincoln. But William Seward, who soon will be Secretary of State, had in his campaign said that he wanted the Indian Territory opened up to white settlement. And once enough whites had gotten there, for the Indian Territory to become a state. Well, the 5 civilized tribes had already experienced this. They had treaties with the United States. Under the Constitution of the United States, the Indian tribes are nations. And so they engage in treaties, just like, say, we might engage in a treaty with Spain or England or any other country. And the difference was that the United States had never respected their treaty rights. And so the Indian nations had treaty rights in Georgia, in Tennessee, North Carolina, in Florida, in Alabama and Mississippi. But when those places became states and the state governments began to put pressure to open up more and more of the Indian land to white settlement, the result had been that the Indians had been uprooted and forced to move, with all of the cultural ramifications and spiritual ramifications that implied. And so on the eve of the American Civil War, as people are making decisions as to which way they're going to go, one of the leading Republicans, the man who was going to be Lincoln's Secretary of State, was putting forth the idea that the Indian Territory should be open to white settlement, and once the whites had settled enough, that then the new state, which today we call Oklahoma, but that new state would come into existence. And besides that, these 5 civilized tribes, and there are the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole. These so-called 5 civilized tribes are called 5 civilized tribes because in the generations prior to removal, they had made a good faith effort to assimilate into the culture that was moving in on their land. They had taken on much of the civilization that was part of the white civilization. Sometimes as religion, the Methodists were particularly strong in trying to convert the Indians. In other ways, in settling down from essentially a hunter-gathering culture to a farming and even plantation culture. And in fact, as you look at the 5 civilized tribes, among the things that they began to do was to acclimate not just to white man's culture, but to Southern culture, which included the ownership of Negro slaves. If you went to the Indian Territory in the 1850s, early 1860s, it would be a slave-holding territory. Slavery was legal in the Indian Territory, and it was practiced by the wealthier members of those 5 civilized tribes. Again, this would make them more sympathetic toward the Confederacy. But in the end, the Native Americans in the Indian Territory would fight their own civil war, their own smaller version of the larger conflict that was going on. And the roots of that smaller conflict had more to do with politics within the Indian tribes than it did with the larger nation-shattering politics of the North and the South. But since the North and the South were splitting into those who favored the Union and those who favored the Confederacy, as the Native Americans in Oklahoma, what is now Oklahoma, the Indian Territory, as they began to interface with the conflict, it meant that they would interface by either siding with the Confederacy or, in a minority of cases, the Indian Territory siding with the Union. A key player in all of this, working for the Confederacy, was a man by the name of Albert Pike. To me, a rather interesting individual, a bit strange in a lot of ways, but Albert Pike is the man that made it possible for the Confederacy to reach out to Native Americans in the Indian Territory and to have success in signing treaties and to getting aid, military aid and support from Native Americans. Pike is interesting because he wasn't born in the South. In fact, he was born far away from the South in Boston, Massachusetts. But as a young man in 1831, he moves first to the West. He does a little fur trapping for a while, but eventually by 1833, he settles in Little Rock, Arkansas. And he's a man of education and of talent and sensitivity. And he's a poet. Now you read his poetry today and it's awful, but in his day, his poetry was frequently published in newspapers and generally liked. And in fact, he even wrote a song that is very similar to Dixie. In fact, a lot of times the lyrics to Dixie would be taken from the song that he wrote. So some people say he wrote one of the several different versions of the anthem that becomes Dixie. But among other things, and most importantly for our purposes, he became a highly successful attorney. And as an attorney, and living in Arkansas, which is not too far from the Indian Territory, he came to represent several of the Indian tribes, in particular the Cherokee, in a number of court cases, suing the federal government for breaches of treaty, and was successful in several of the court cases. Thus, he became one of the few Anglos, for lack of a better term, one of the few Caucasians, for lack of a better term, who was actually quite popular among the Native Americans. They trusted him. They saw him as someone who looked out for their interest. And it's for that reason, in 1861, he was sent to the Indian Territory to negotiate with them and to try to make treaties bringing the Indians on the side of giving aid to the Confederate States of America. And he was successful. All 5 of the Indian tribes signed treaties with the Confederacy. all 5 of the civilized tribes signed treaties with the Confederacy. And what did the Confederacy have to offer them? Well, first of all, it offered them the statement that they would respect any treaty the United States had made with them, and they would keep that treaty. Secondly, they said that that once the Confederate States of America was established, including what is now Oklahoma, that the Native Americans would have their own particular rights of governance in the Indian Territory, that they would have the right to their own laws, and to, in essence, the right to reestablish their civilization, which had been pretty much ripped from them by the actions of the federal government over the last 30 years. And he was successful. Now, in terms of what happened after that, the Indians did contribute to the Confederacy. There's several battles, especially in the Trans-Mississippi, in the area west of the Mississippi River, in which Native Americans participated. The most notable of these was Pea Ridge in 1862. And 1862 Pea Ridge was a defeat for the Confederacy, but at the same time, the rear guard that kept the Confederate Army from being thoroughly defeated was made up of the Native Americans that Albert Pike had secured. Unfortunately for Albert Pike, he had a kind of strange personality. And late in 1862, he and the leaders of the Confederate government had a falling out. A little difficult to explain what it had to do. Mainly it had to do with his personality. And so he resigned his commission. And after early 1863, he played almost no role of any significance in the Confederate activities. But initially, he's the man that won over all 5 tribes to the Confederacy. The problem for the 5 tribes, however, was that 3 of them, and that's the Creek, Cherokee, and the Seminole, 3 of those 5 tribes were themselves divided. Coming out of the activities, going back to the Trail of Tears, going back to the ethnic cleansing that got everybody out to Oklahoma, there had developed divisions. Several people had, back in the 1830s, proclaimed themselves leaders who weren't leaders, especially the Cherokee, a man by the name of Ross, for example, and then signed treaties saying that we will trade land out west, meaning the Indian Territory, for land we have in Georgia and elsewhere. And so there was recrimination among the Native Americans, especially among the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole. So they were divided into factions. What that meant was initially they supported the Confederacy. But as the fate of the Confederacy began to wane, as the Confederacy began to weaken, the divisions within these 3 tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole, also divided. And a minority in that division switched sides and began to join what was called the Home Guard, join with the Union. Now, what was causing that? Well, what was causing that had to do with a place just north of the Indian Territory called Kansas. As the Civil War developed, the people of Kansas felt pretty threatened. Federal troops had left Kansas. Native Americans to the south, they saw as a threat to their livelihoods. They didn't have any protection. And so the people of Kansas began to ask the federal government to send military support. And what the federal government did was to send Major General James G. Blunt out there, and he was an effective fellow, to basically recruit among the Native Americans basically to divide the heretofore almost solid Confederate support. And it led to a nasty little guerrilla war in the Indian Territory. as the Union-supported Home Guard often clashed with the Confederate troops, especially under General Waddy, Stan Waddy, and, and Oklahoma, as we would call it today, the Indian Territory, ran with as much blood as any other part of the United States across the years from 1861 to 1865. On the other hand, two of the tribes, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw, uh, they, uh, they were more united. They didn't suffer the extensive divisions that had occurred in the other tribes growing out of the Trail of Tears. And they were also much more into slave ownership. They were much more into the kind of entrepreneurial business side of Anglo civilization. And they did not divide. Their support for the Confederacy remained strong from the moment they signed the treaty until the last Confederate surrendered. And of course, the last Confederate to surrender was a Native American, Brigadier General Stan Waddy, leader of the Cherokee tribe. Um, he is, as I said earlier, the only Native American for the Union or the Confederacy to be made to the rank of general. And he becomes the last general to surrender at the end of the American Civil War, June 23, 1865. So that's the Indian Territory. But the other major event that occurred, and the trauma of that event will last even longer, was the Sioux Indian War. The Sioux Indian War itself was relatively short. I mean, literally it begins on August 17, 1862, and it comes to an end on September 26, 1862. But the ramifications of that Sioux Indian War are still felt today. The ramifications of this brief, really outbreak is the only way I can describe it. This brief, intense, emotional rupture in the scene of things. It was so powerful, so intense, so traumatic that the results of it are still felt today. So what's happening? Well, think about the American military, especially the American Army, as it existed in 1860. The Civil War begins in 1861. Where is the American military in 1860? What's its purpose in 1860? And for the most part, the purpose of the American military in 1860 is to man forts along the frontier, to guard the frontier where there is the constant rubbing together of Anglos who are moving westward and Native Americans who are feeling the cultural pressure that the Anglos would have. These two completely different civilizations that were not getting along with each other. In Abilene, Texas, which is where I've lived for the last almost 40 years, in Abilene, Texas, just out of Abilene, Texas, you have Fort Phantom, which was one of the early forts that was built. It was built in the middle of nowhere and it had terrible water and it only lasted a couple of years. But that was the whole purpose of that fort, was to be a barrier between the Native Americans and the white civilization that existed about 150 miles to the east along what is now Fort Worth and Dallas. And you'll notice the name Fort Worth, again, the military heading to the west with the purpose of keeping peace, or really keeping a separation between Native Americans and the Anglo population, the Caucasian population, the white population. And of course, there at Fort Chadbourne, after the Civil War, of course, you have the St. Angelo Fort. But the American military was focused mainly on the far west and dealing with this whole issue of trying to keep peace between Native Americans who were fearful of white Western encroachments upon their territory, their land, and their civilization, and the whites who had ambitions to bring cities and schools and industry and farms to this magnificent opening country of ours. But then what happens in 1861? The Civil War breaks out. There's a tremendous need for troops, especially for troops who are trained and who understand how the military works. And as a result of that, American troops, U.S. Army troops, are pulled out of the West. They're pulled out of the forts, and they're brought to where they can face the crisis of the rebellion, the crisis of the creation of the Confederate States of America, and the resulting military conflict that resulted out of that. All of a sudden, in areas that were very tense, there was no longer the protection that had once existed. And this was particularly important in a place called Minnesota. Minnesota had only just become a state. And if you look at Minnesota, you can see the very thing that the 5 civilized tribes living in the Indian Territory feared. Let's say that once again. If you look at the situation in Minnesota in the 5 or 6 years leading up to the American Civil War, you have the cultural phenomenon that the 5 civilized tribes living in Oklahoma could see, and they feared and repeat in their place that was already happening in Minnesota. Well, what was happening in Minnesota? In Minnesota, you have a number of Indian nations. Sometimes it's a little hard for us to understand that. The Sioux would be an Indian nation, and then you would have various tribes such as the Dakotas. And the Dakotas will play the main role in what's happening in Minnesota. But each of these tribes would have signed a treaty with the American government. And from that treaty, they would agree to move west to settle in land that was to ever be theirs, and where they could maintain their cultural values and be free from the encroachment of for lack of a better term, white civilization. Well, when Minnesota was set up basically as an Indian reserve, pretty much the same way that the Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma was set up, there was no real fear that whites would move into that area, except for people called the Germans, the German immigrants. In the early 1850s, you have a series of rebellions in Germany, democratic rebellions that fail. And if you fail in that kind of rebellion, you end up with 2 situations. You can remain in Germany, where you're likely to be executed. And they were executing people by the tens of thousands who had supported democracy. There was a fear in the German states that Germany would be just like the French Revolution. They feared that. And so their option in that case was to take everyone that supported democracy, liberty, equality, fraternity, and either execute them or force them to flee. And they fled, not by the hundreds, not by the thousands, but by the tens of thousands. And a significant portion of those fled to the United States. And when they fled to the United States, they tended to settle in 3 areas. Texas, because it was a new republic. It opened up lots of land that was inexpensive. And that's why you have places like Fredericksburg in Texas today. They also came to the area around St. Louis, and had already begun to affect the culture of Missouri, making Missouri, because these people believed in liberty, a slave state with a significant number of abolitionists in it. But the other place where they came in massive numbers was at Wisconsin and Minnesota. And when these Germans, by the thousands, settled in Minnesota, they began to interface with the Native Americans and they could not have been more different culturally. The Native Americans were hunters, quite literally. They depended upon game. They depended upon gathering fruit in a season, and their culture was built around that. The people in Minnesota wanted to settle and to replicate the German villages they had known back in Europe, to engage in farming and to practice the very powerful Lutheran religion. For the most part, they were Lutherans and a goodly number of Catholics as well. And immediately, the German culture had no respect for these barbarians as they saw the Indians, for these uncultured savages as they saw the Indians. And when I say they have no respect, what began to happen was that the casual murdering of Indians, the casual raping of Indian women went on. And that's why the federal government, in large numbers, were coming there. And there was a crisis developing. To deal with that crisis, the American military had established a significant number of forts. And these forts were there to keep the two sides separated from each other. They were also there to allow Indian agents to trade with the Indians, providing goods that the American government had promised the Indians that they would have access to. And even as from time to time, there'd be a modification of treaties. And every time there was a modification of treaties, Indian land was given up in turn for promise that the federal government would send in supplies and food and that sort of thing. Well, once the Civil War developed, two things happened. The first thing that happened was the military largely left the area. And the second thing that happened was that the federal government, with all of the bureaucracy and all of the costs of the American Civil War, began to become later and later and later in providing the financial supplements that were negotiated for to replace the land that had been taken over. And that meant that Native Americans could not purchase simple things like food. And they couldn't hunt because their hunting lands had become smaller and smaller. And so quite literally, they were facing starvation. And so ultimately, the federal agents in Minnesota appealed to the merchants who were licensed to trade with the Indians, saying, you've got to extend them credit. You've got to do something until we can get financial money in here for them to develop. And the merchants said no, they didn't trust the credit. And so when they didn't trust the credit, one of them, Andrew Myrick was his name, when the pressure was put on him to extend credit to the Indians, he said, so far as I am concerned, if the Indians are hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung. And that was quite insulting. In other words, if they're willing to buy my food that I have, I'll sell it to them. But if the government insists I give them credit, it's not going to happen. As far as I'm concerned, if they're hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung. That was incredibly insulting. So there began to be this clamor, there began to be this concern. And as a result of that concern, the principal Indian leader, whose Anglo name was Little Crow, I have no ability to pronounce any Indian name that I've ever seen. But to Anglos, he was known as Little Crow. And he began to see how restive, especially the young men, were under his leadership. And he kept warning them, don't do anything foolish. Because if you do something foolish, you will die like rabbits. You'll die like rabbits. Well, the foolishness happened. And Little Crow became the leader. He had to give leadership to his people under the circumstances. And on August the 17th, you began a series of massacres. And that's exactly what it was, massacres, mainly of civilians. because there was this pent-up anger, this pent-up bitterness among the Native Americans and all the abuse they had to suffer and couldn't do anything about because the American military was there to keep them from doing it. The American military was gone now. This is, again, propaganda. This is from one of the illustrated newspapers. I wasn't able to find out if it was Frank Leis's newspaper or Harper's, or I'm pretty sure it wasn't the London Illustrated Times. But it shows the savagery that was going on. And this is one of the few times when that probably approached the actual savagery that was going on. We do not know how many civilians were killed. The low estimate is 450. The high estimate is 800. Now, given all this sound going on in the American Civil War, that doesn't sound like a lot. But remember, this is happening to civilians. And it wasn't just a matter of people getting killed. You're talking about women being raped. You're talking about people being eviscerated, bodies being mutilated, people being tortured while they're still alive. It was for lack of a better term, and I can only use this kind of term, it was a lashing out against all of the pent up pressure that had been developing for the better part of a decade. Refugees began to flee. This is one of the early images that you have of large numbers of people who are fleeing their homes. These are Germans trying their best to get out of the path of this unrestrained mob that is attacking village and town after village and town, and everywhere it goes, the result is unspeakable abuse. But at a time when the Union was facing its greatest crisis, because I think the fall of 1862 was its greatest crisis. Now, our next lecture will be Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and those are important, don't get me wrong. But the one time when the North came very close to not being able to contain the Confederacy was actually in the autumn of 1862. Remember a lecture that we gave on the three invasions of Kentucky and northern Mississippi and the Antietam. And so it's during that period of time that all of a sudden the American military has to refocus on the Indian Territory, has to take combat troops out of the line, trying to desperately keep the Confederates from winning the war, and send them back up to Minnesota to put this outrage down. And when it was finally put down at the end of September, in November, there were trials. 498 Native Americans, members of the Dakoda Indian tribe, were brought to trial. And 305 were sentenced to death. Now, by any stretch of the imagination, these trials were a sham. Quite a number of them lasted less than 5 minutes. There were military trials, so they were conducted with military officers voting, and it took a 2/3 vote of any set of military officers to condemn a person to death. And the officers who were holding this trial were the same people who had seen women eviscerated, had heard the testimony of women who had been raped, who had private parts mutilated, and had seen their babies smashed into trees. And so they're called trials only because there was a formality. There's no question about the extent to which these trials were anything but an example of justice. And while the men were put on trial, the Indian women, the Dakota women, and their children were rounded up, and they were placed in a fairly large detention camp. There were a total of 1,600, approximately, a total of 1,600 women and children placed in this camp. And within a year, 300 of them had died In our last lecture, we talked about the prison camp experience and the high death rate that prison camps experiences. And for that matter, in camps in general, because again, a lack of knowledge of disease wasn't necessary that they were trying to torture these people, but on the other hand, there wasn't any sympathy for them either. And nearly a quarter, 23% of the women that were placed in this detention camp died. Women and children died. So what was Abraham Lincoln's response? Put this in perspective. In the autumn of 1862, Abraham Lincoln is dealing with the Emancipation Proclamation and all the political ramifications of that. He's dealing with the most desperate point militarily of the entire Civil War, with Confederate armies threatening to overwhelm 3 different places the Union commands. He's dealing with a lot of issues, and then all of a sudden, it's laid on his desk, the death warrants, because he's president and because this was a federal trial. He's laid on his desk the death warrants of 305 individuals. For a moment, we need to think like Abraham Lincoln. There's a lot of myths about Lincoln. There's a concept called civil religion in our culture, in every culture. There's civil religion, even in atheist cultures like the old Soviet Union or China. Believe me, Mao Zedong is a god. I've been there. And Lenin and Karl Marx are gods in the sense that they are treated in a civil religion way that makes them into mortals for sure, but they're really the gods that we live by. And in America, we have a tendency to make our founding fathers and a few others, including Abraham Lincoln, into gods, so that the real Abraham Lincoln never gets seen, but instead we have Abraham Lincoln, the humane fellow that forgives a Union soldier who goes to sleep as a sentry and is to be executed. And so it's a little hard to think of Abraham Lincoln as the real human being. But the real human being, Abraham Lincoln, was an attorney, trained as an attorney, a man who revered the law and revered the justice that went along with that law. And so when he received the death warrants of 305 individuals, and when he began to see the nature of the transcripts of the trials, he saw a tremendous injustice being done. And so in the midst of everything else that was going on, Lincoln and his cabinet began to sit down and to review in detail every one of those 305 sentences of death. Lincoln's position from a legal perspective was this. He said, first, it was a war. And insofar as it was a war, when people engage in military activities, that is not a cause for the death penalty. Okay? In other words, it's a short war, but it's a war. People have grievances. They fought a rebellion in essence, and they were defeated. But defeat in a rebellion does not lead to you being executed. However, if you've committed war crimes, and the torture and mutilation and the wanton killing of civilians is a war crime. And so as they reviewed each one of those 305 cases, and it took hours and sometimes days, and sometimes communication back and forth that led to weeks. And there weren't that many weeks that they could deal with this before Lincoln finally concluded that 39 of these men were deserving of death, that they had exceeded the laws of reasonable activity in war, that they had committed what we today would call war crimes. Now, just before the executions took place, additional evidence was supplied on one of the men, and so his sentence was commuted. In other words, lawyers for this individual was able to get the information to Abraham Lincoln that said no, that he did not commit what you're calling war crimes, But that left 38 individuals who were proclaimed by Abraham Lincoln of being guilty of war crimes. And in Mankato, Minnesota, on December 26, 1862, these men were placed on they were placed to be hung, and a rope was chopped, and all 38 fell to their deaths. And since then, many people have referred to them as the Dakota 38. But they were men whose cases were reviewed and who, by the standards of the times, were judged to have committed acts that were so heinous as to be war crimes, and not necessarily heroes, and certainly not necessarily victims. Well, a brief epilogue to the Sioux uprising. There were ramifications of it. Among the ramifications was something called the Sand Creek Massacre, which occurred 2 years later in November 29, 1864. The Indians involved in the Sand Creek Massacre were not Sioux. The Indians involved in the Sand Creek Massacre had gone out of their way to say to the American military in Colorado, because that's where it's located, to say to the American military in Colorado, eastern Colorado, by the way, I've almost been there. And in our question and answer session, I would love for somebody to ask me why I've almost been there, because I took a very long trip and didn't get there. And I'd love to explain that to you. But eastern Colorado is not the Rockies. Eastern Colorado is not that breathtakingly beautiful vistas where you see peaks and snow even in the summertime. Eastern Colorado is flat, ugly, boring plains, but a place where once the buffalo roamed in massive numbers. And these Indians went to the American military and said, "We are peaceful. We support the Union. We're neutral." In every way possible, they made it known that they were not a warlike tribe and they were not going to cause any problem. Unfortunately for them, the Colorado Volunteers, feeling mainly ideas that were whipped up by the standard prejudices of the time and whipped up even larger by the events that had occurred among the Sioux Indians 2 years before, on the morning at dawn, November 29, 1864, they surrounded the encampment of these Indians at a place called Sand Creek. Now, to show you a little bit of something that happened, this was a starving time. It's wintertime, and food is growing low. And so about 3 days before, word had been sent to this encampment that there were buffalo about 2 or 3 days away. And most of the younger men had gone on a journey to kill the buffalo and bring food back to this place. So basically, what was at Sand Creek was old men, women, and children. And at dawn, the Colorado Volunteers surrounded Sand Creek and not only began to kill as many Indians as they could, some were able to flee, but the leader of these immediately became a hero. He announced to all the people that he'd killed somewhere between 400 and 600. We really don't know. Low estimates say it was only 70. That's far too low. But probably around 400 to 600 were killed. But they weren't just killed. They were mutilated. I'm just going to choose one of these three quotations. Later, when you receive these, you can read the others. But let's look at Stan Hogue. He was one of the ones that was there. And a number of these volunteers had consciences, and they were appalled by what they saw. And so here's what Stan Hogue said. "Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of one Indian, White Antelope, lay solitary in the creek bed and was a prime target. And besides being scalped, the soldiers cut off his ears and nose and testicles. The last were to make a tobacco pouch." I'm going to go ahead and read another one. Another soldier, Major Anthony, years later said this. "There was a little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. And the little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. And I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards, drop his rifle and fire, and he missed the child. And another came up and said, let me try to get the son of a bitch. I can sit down and fire at the little, and hit him. And he got down off his horse and kneeled down and fired at the little child, but he missed too. But a third man came up and made a similar remark, and he fired, and the little fellow dropped. Or Robert Bent, as again he told the New York Tribune some years later, I saw one squaw lying on her back whose legs had been broken. And a soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. And she raised her arm to protect herself, and he struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over and raised her other arm, and he struck, breaking that. And then he left her there without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open and an unborn child laying by her side. It is the worst single atrocity committed in American history on American soil. And who was that commander? His name was John M. Shivington, a Methodist minister who believed it was God's will, especially after what he had seen happen in Minnesota, that Indians be eradicated. When asked about the killing of women and little children, here's his response. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use every means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little. Nits make lice. Nits are lice eggs. Nits make lice. Epilogue. We've all heard of the Mayo Clinic. W.W. Mayo was the creator of the Mayo Clinic. And there is a very close association between W.W. Mayo and the Sioux Indian uprising, in fact, the Dakota 38. As soon as the 38 men were hanged, as soon as life left their body, they were descended upon by medical doctors, including W.W. Mayo, and they secured their bodies for the purposes of committing autopsies. The beginning of the Mayo Clinic began in large measure when one of those 38 men was taken back to the clinic that would become the Mayo Hospital, and he was dissected for the students there. Then W.W. Mayo had the man defleshed, his skeleton placed back together, and for many years that skeleton was used to teach students at the Mayo Clinic basic anatomy. And Mayo's sons, all of whom became prominent medical doctors in his system, learned their first anatomy lessons from one of the men who was hanged, and then whose skeleton became a teaching exhibit. So think about that the next time that you hear a reference to the Mayo Clinic. Well, that's the end of this lecture. It's not been the most upbeat one in the world, but I'd love to hear your responses. Okay.
Does anybody have any questions or statements for Fred?
Fred? The when the Cherokee sided with the Confederates, did that partnership last as long as they thought it would, or was it just something temporarily?
Well, there were Cherokees who stayed with the Confederacy for the whole war, of which Stan Waddy was their leader, and he was the most prominent leader among any of the military people connected with not just the Cherokees, but with the 5 civilized tribes. However, in the case of the Cherokees were the most divided. It was the Cherokees who were finally uprooted out of Georgia and Western North Carolina that became the essence of the Trail of Tears. And within the Cherokee Nation in the Indian Territory, there were some leaders who were associated with creating or helping to create the Trail of Tears. And those leaders had their followers, but at the same time, of all of the groups in what becomes Oklahoma, all the groups that were part of the Indian Territory, the Cherokee was most divided. And by the end of the war, a majority of the Cherokee actually sided with the Union. But at the same time, there was this hardcore among the Cherokee led by Stan Waddy, and they fought until there just wasn't anybody fighting anymore. So that in June, late June of 1865, Stan Waddy and his basically Indian cavalry becomes the last military unit to surrender on American soil. Now there is another unit called the Shenandoah that surrenders in Liverpool, and that's the last time the Confederate flag comes down. But the last military unit to surrender at the end of the Civil War was a Cherokee leader by the name of Stan Waddy.
The soldiers that were fighting, primarily we had the Civil War going on in its main theater, and then over here in the West, Colorado, Wyoming, Minnesota, those that were further out west, were those commissioned soldiers or those state militias or volunteers or a little bit of everything?
Yeah, they actually came from three different sources. Most of the commissioned officers and the regular troops will end up back in the East because they're the best trained. They're the ones that can train others. And so as the war develops, these very professional soldiers, for lack of a better term, are drawn away. And so what you end up with is, in the case of Chivington, Colorado Volunteers. Now, we've heard of Chivington's name in an earlier lecture. You might recall we talked about the New Mexico expedition, which finally ended at Glorieta Pass. And while that was technically a Confederate victory, a portion of the Union Army, commanded by, at that time, Major Chivington, came upon the Confederate baggage train, killed all the mules and horses it could, and destroyed all the food it could. And so even though the Union Army ended up retreating, the Confederates were left in the middle of nowhere with no supplies and no horses. And so they began to walk back to Texas, and a high percentage of those men quite literally starved to death. And that was Chivington who created that situation. This is the same Chivington that ends up at Sand Creek.
Thank you.
Fred,
Yes.
I have
Yes.
2 questions.
Okay.
The first one, I can understand how the 38 were executed because of war crimes. So my question is, were any of the men under Chivington similarly tried for what they did to those Indians?
There was a court of inquiry. And in fact, there's this marvelous set of books called The Official Records of the Union and Confederate Armies. It's literally 900 volumes. And here in Abilene, a complete set is available at Hardin Simmons University. At Abilene Christian, you get it on microfilm, or you can hit up a good friend of mine who has his own personal copy of the reproductions. But one of the volumes was devoted to this tremendous event at the Sand Creek. And you can read that, and I have read the testimonies of the men. The men who participated, the Colorado volunteers who participated, ended up being divided into 2 groups. The vast majority had no problem with what they did. We have letters, we have testimonies for the rest of their lives where they make no apology for the atrocity they committed. And then you have a smaller number who, first of all, testified in late 1864, early 1865 in the court of inquiry. And secondly, later, you have, again, these same men and others whose conscience is hurting them, who want to make themselves right with God and with civilization. Among them, by the way, Kit Carson. Kit Carson was at Sand Creek. But early on, he comes out and says, man, I had nothing to do with that. I don't respect it. I was appalled at what happened. But what you had were volunteers. You had untrained, in essence, people who lacked discipline and who were out for retribution for what had happened among the Sioux 2 years earlier. And leading that retribution was Chivington. What happened to Chivington? Well, his military career was pretty much over with, but that's about all that happened to him. And remember, I said that I convinced Bonnie. We were heading out to Greeley, Colorado, where at the time my son and daughter-in-law lived. And I said, look, I don't know when I'm going to get back to Colorado. Let's take a side trip. I had no idea how big Colorado was. And we went through some of the most boring territory available. And we ended up in a little bitty town, population 3 at the moment, called Shivington, named after John Shivington. And right next to Shivington is the road that leads to Sand Creek. And I got about a quarter mile down the road, and there was this barrier, impossible to get around. Big ditches on both sides. I'm not going to be able to get my little car around that. And it said, road under construction. Got back to Shivington, met the postmistress, one of the 3 people that lived there. And she said, oh yes, that's been under construction for the last 20 years. In other words, so many people had come to Sand Creek to protest because it is it's that the government decided to repair the road, and they had basically been repairing it for 20 years. In other words, nothing was going on. They just had barriers that you couldn't get to Sand Creek at the time. I don't know if you can do it today, but I went a long ways to end up seeing nothing.
That was my second question.
Shivington lives out his life. He eventually gets old and lives with his daughter, and he kind of lives under a shadow, but nobody was significantly punished for what happened at Sand Creek. But the memory of Sand Creek is very powerful among Native Americans.
Fred,
Did he remain a Methodist minister?
good question.
When the Methodists try to explain that, it gets a little complicated. He was a Methodist minister, no question about that. But then there has to do with the way ministers are assigned where they are. Like if you decide to stay where you want to stay, you fall into kind of an unofficial status. And honestly, I'm not enough into Methodist politics to fully appreciate all of that. But the Methodists do all they can today to try to say, well, he'd been a Methodist minister, but by the time this happened, he was no longer a Methodist minister. But that's kind of like shifting cards. He was a Methodist minister and very Calvinistic in his thinking. We're in a contractual relationship with God. The Indians are the Canaanites, and they're savages and they're vicious. Look what happened with the Sioux, and this became justification for what he did. And there were a lot of people that supported him.
Fred, Myrna says, it was my thought that most of the records that happened with the Confederate were burned. So are these
No,
written from memory?
No. Actually, oh my goodness. I actually had talked about this in an earlier lecture. When Jefferson Davis became president, and of course that was in Montgomery, Alabama, the first commanding general that he appointed is a name nobody ever hears of. And right now I can't even draw it up. But this man was appointed and remains an important person all through the war. And fundamentally, he was in charge of keeping all the records, okay? And all those records ended up obviously in Richmond, Virginia. And when the war was coming to an end, he saw to it that those records were not destroyed. And he voluntarily turned over all of those records to the federal government. And so when you see this volume, this 900 volume set that I'm talking about, it's an incredible set. A little difficult to use. It's got an index, for the whole thing. And then each volume has an index, but each volume sometimes is made up of 3 volumes. So you got, it's really complicated. But it has all the surviving records of both the Union and Confederate Army. And it would not have been possible had this man burned them at the end of the war when Richmond was evacuated. And instead, realizing the historical importance of them, he preserved them. And for that, he deserves some consideration as we decide who's going to heaven and who's not. I won't judge who can get to heaven and who won't, and I won't judge him, but I'll testify on his behalf just for that act alone.
Steve says, I know at the prison camp in Tyler, the records are a mix of everything.
I'm sorry.
Steve said, I know at the prison camp in Tyler, the records are a mix of everything.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's I have spent my life in archives, and I'm one of those rare people. I mean, a glorious day to me is a day with boxes of letters that I'm going through for a purpose. And when it comes to the American Civil War, everything from soldiers' diaries to the internal communication, a lot of it's there. Now, a lot, because of the nature of time, has been destroyed. Can I give you a personal example of one that's been destroyed? I was a graduate student, and I was the graduate research assistant for something called the Andrew Johnson Papers Project, which has now been completed. That was 50 years ago. But it was a project to collect as much of the information, primary source information, letters, diaries, newspaper accounts, etc., on Andrew Johnson, who became president of the United States. And there was a newspaper called the Nashville Unionist, or the Nashville Union, rather. It's a pro-union newspaper established after Nashville fell to the Union Army. And so July 4th, 1863, military governor Andrew Johnson gave a 4th of July speech. And the editorial had said, a marvelous speech by Governor Johnson. And we're going to publish it tomorrow because everybody needs to read it. You know, this was 4th of July, 1863. Well, it turned out on the 4th of July, 1863, there was a lot of news. I mean, Gettysburg and Vicksburg and you know, so I'm sitting there on microfilm, following it day by day, and every day it's promising we're going to publish this. Finally, along about July 10th, they said, doesn't matter. Whatever news happens, you will get this fantastic speech given by Andrew Johnson. So knowing that I had discovered a coup, knowing that the editors that I was working for needed to impress are going to be so impressed with what I found, I turned the crank to the next day, and somebody had taken a razor blade because that speech was so important. They had cut it out to display somewhere or something. So there was a big note that said, this page is no longer extant. So sometimes historical records surviving is an accident. It was a glorious accident when that important Confederate general who was in charge of all the archives of the Confederacy made sure they didn't burn, and he turned them over.
Well, does anybody have anything else?
Well, 48 hours from now, we're going to look at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. And by the way, was Abraham Lincoln the most racist president we've ever had? My simple answer is by no means. I mean, you've got Zachary Taylor, who owned nearly 300 slaves. I think that's pretty racist. You've got Woodrow Wilson. It's said of him that during his administration, the experience of Black Americans reached their nadir in American history. A nadir means their lowest point. And, you know, in other words, Black Americans didn't reach their lowest point under slavery. They reached their lowest point under the policies created by Woodrow Wilson. Yes, Lincoln was a racist, no question about it. But it was a time in which the culture and everything around him. And even people who supported the abolition of slavery was racist by any standard that we would have today, which goes back to the problem of putting a moralistic judgment on the past. Just because people believe differently from the way we believe today doesn't necessarily mean they're evil. And the destruction of statues and the destruction of icons and the burning of records destroys memory and destroys the very fiber of civilization that we have, and is a tragic element of our culture today, that we are undergoing something that's very similar to the French Revolution, to the cultural revolution, to the Taliban and their destruction of 2,000 years of civilization from time to time. I regret that. But on the other hand, I'm glad to be alive. I'm glad to have a chance to share with everyone. And I wish everyone a good 48 hours until we get to join. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Fred.
Thank
Have
you.
a good next couple of days. We will see you on Thursday.
I hope so.
Everybody.
Yep, that was great today, Fred. Thank you.
Well, it's stuff that I've enjoyed. Okay. Bye-bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thank you.